If you like audiobooks or audio shows, check out a free trial of Audible. Just click the link in the description.
Welcome to Mindshock. This is Bruce McGuire.
It's Sid Irwin.
And we are here with a special Halloween edition of the Mindshock podcast. The occult origins of the Grimm fairy tales. The Brothers Grimm, who have assembled fairy tales, and their origins are not quite what some think they are or what is popularized. They are actually very, very dark indeed, and we will be going over them. So make sure your nightlight is on, grab your blankie, and settle in for some creepy, spooky, and terrifyingly mind-shocking material, as usual, on the Mindshock podcast. If you enjoy the podcast, you can donate to our PayPal. Just check the link in the description. Make sure you subscribe to the channel, hit the bell for notifications. Make sure you allow your device to have those notifications come through. You can also just go to youtube.com/Mindshock to check out all the latest podcasts and videos. If you like this particular podcast, hit that like button, share it across social media platforms, of which you can find us: Twitter, Facebook, Reddit, Patreon. Patrons do get priority for case topic, logical analysis, co-podcaster requests. You could also be a guest on the podcast depending on your tier. Questions, comments, theories, thoughts, suggestions, rebuttals, debunkings of any kind, leave them in the comment section. All right, Sid, are you sure you can handle this episode? It's not too scary for you?
I'm actually rather intrigued and excited to do this. I'm a big fan of the old fairy tales, and then as I got older and found out about where the origins really sparked from for most of them, it was rather intriguing to hear that they took such dark and disturbing tales and then watered them down so that all the kids can enjoy.
Well, yeah, a lot of people. I mean, I don't know how many people out there that know that the basis for most of Disney movies and Disney tales were actually the Grimm's brothers' fairy tales and other folkloric tales. So I'm going to read this article from nationalgeographic.com to set the tone. This was published in 2019, History Magazine. Brothers Grimm fairy tales were never meant for kids. The world's most famous collection of children's stories began as an academic study for adults when Jacob and Wilhelm Grimm collected German folklore in the 1800s. This article is written by Isabel Hernandez. Folk tales are as old as human civilization itself, a synthesis of the spoken and the scripted, a fusion of different accounts of the same story. The story of Cinderella, for example, appeared in ancient China and in ancient Egypt. Details in the telling change depending on the storyteller's cultural origins. In Egypt, her slippers are red leather, while in the West Indies, breadfruit, not a pumpkin, is the transformative object. The story of Cinderella that appears in Jacob and Wilhelm Grimm's collection of Germanic folktales, first published in 1812, might shock those familiar with today's version of a scullery maid turned princess. In the Brothers Grimm telling, their heroine is called Ashhunpotel, and her wishes come true not from the wave of a fairy godmother's wand, but from a hazel tree growing on her mother's grave, which she waters with her flowing tears. When the prince comes to find the dainty foot that will match the single slipper, which is gold, not glass, the stepsisters do not shove and shriek, but dismember, one cutting off her big toe to try to make the shoe fit, the other cutting part of her heel. And at the story's close, Cinderella's wedding to the prince includes two white birds, which, rather than cheerfully tweet Cinderella on her way to happily ever after, peck out her stepsister's eyes. Quite dark indeed. Can you imagine reading that to a little 5-year-old or something?
I could. I'm always worried about the reaction they might have, because they might just be yipping hooray because the stepsisters deserved it.
The Brothers Grimm published what would become one of the most influential and famous collections of folklore in the world, Children's and Household Tales, Kinder- und Hausmärchen, later titled Grimm's Fairy Tales, are childhood-defining stories. The Grimms, however, had curated the collection as an academic anthology for scholars of German culture, not as a collection of bedtime stories for young readers. Amid the political and social turbulence of the Napoleonic Wars, 1803 to 1815, as France conquered Germanic lands, Jacob and Wilhelm were driven by nationalism to highlight their homeland and heritage. They were inspired by German Romantic authors and philosophers who believed that the purest forms of culture, those that bonded a community, could be found in stories shared from generation to generation. Storytelling expressed the essence of German culture and recalled the spirit and basic values of its people. By excavating Germany's oral tradition, the brothers urgently sought to preserve them from vanishing, to be forever silent in the tumult of our times. And just as a quick offshoot, National Geographic also published this article, Fairy Tales Are Much Older Than You Think, by Nina Strachlich. At least one has been traced back to the Bronze Age. This was published December 2017. Tales as old as time. The Smith and the Devil originated 6,000 years ago. A blacksmith trades his soul to the devil for the power to weld any materials together. With his wish granted, the man traps the devil, sticking him to the ground until the evil spirit releases him from the bargain. That's quite dark. Friends in Life and Death, 2,000 years ago. A man invites his dead friend to his wedding. When the groom accompanies his friend to the underworld, 400 years pass and he misses his own nuptials. A boy steals the ogre's treasure. This is 4,500 years ago. A boy trespasses into a giant's house to steal his treasure. When the giant comes home, the boy hides and then manages to evade the giant's pursuit. Finally, the boy kills the giant and takes his treasure. And that's always really, really creepy how giants are so prevalent in ancient folklore. It's almost like all of these stories have some original sources that might actually have some truth in them. What do you think about that?
I mean, considering that so many from various areas can depict something so similar in such a fashion.
Yeah.
Again, I could see that. I could agree with that. Or even then that you have one original wandering storyteller who just happens to have funny things.
Oh, wow, that's funny. I actually hadn't thought of that. That's very interesting. It doesn't have to be one. It could be possibly a group of wandering storytellers that went to different areas, and that group all comes from the same place and has the same stories. That's quite
Very much so.
interesting as well. Very interesting. Some other stories that are quite old are the animal bridegroom 3,000 years ago. Picking a rose lands a father in debt to a beast. In exchange for his freedom, his daughter is taken prisoner. After falling in love with the beast, she must overcome a curse to transform him into a prince. The supernatural helper 2,500 years ago. A peasant falsely tells the king his daughter can spin gold out of straw. An elfin creature appears, offering the real skill in exchange for her firstborn child. The only way out is to guess his name, which she does. How does the same story come to be known as Beauty and the Beast in the US and the fairy serpent in China? As Wilhelm and Jacob Grimm collected Germanic folk tales in the 19th century, they realized that many were similar stories told in distant parts of the world. The brothers Grimm wondered whether plot similarities indicated a shared ancestry thousands of years old. Folk tales are passed down orally, obscuring their age and origin. There's no fossil record of them before the invention of writing, says Jamie Tarani, an anthropologist at Durham University. To test the Grimm's theory, Tarani and literary scholar Sarah Graca da Silva traced 76 basic plots to their oldest linguistic ancestor using an international folklore database. If a similar tale was told in German and Hindi, the researchers concluded its roots lay in the language's last common ancestor. The Smith and the Devil, a story about a man who trades his soul for blacksmith skills, was first told some 6,000 years ago, Proto-Indo-European. So quite interesting. And we will also explore how Tartaria, Atlantis, or some of these mud flood theories might have played into fairy tales of old. So back to the original article. Once upon a time, like Cinderella and many of the characters in their folktales, the story of Jacob and Wilhelm Grimm is a rags to riches one. The brothers were born 1 year apart in Hanau in the Holy Roman Empire state of Hesse-Kassel in present-day Germany near Frankfurt. In 1796, just a few days after Jacob, the eldest, turned 11, their father died suddenly of pneumonia, plunging the once middle-class family of 6 children into poverty. 2 years later, Jacob and Wilhelm left home to attend high school in Kassel, a privilege made possible by their aunt's financial support. The inseparable pair shared the same diligent work habits, studying for up to 12 hours a day. After graduating, Jacob moved to Marburg in 1802 to study law at the university. Wilhelm followed a year later. Most of the students from wealthier families received a tuition stipend, but the Grimms' drastic change in financial circumstance and thus social status meant they had to pay for their own education. But this setback later proved fortuitous. As Jacob later wrote in his autobiography, sparseness spurns a person to industriousness and work. The pair had entered the university intending to echo their father's career in law and civil service, but identifying with the hardworking folk whose language and stories they would later preserve and publish, they instead discovered a vocation that would define their lives and legacy: finding folk tales. Friedrich Karl von Savigny, a professor at the University of Marburg, sparked Jacob and Wilhelm's interest in German history and literature and the new field of philology, the study of language and historical texts. Savigny introduced the brothers to his scholarly circle of Clemens Brentano and Achim von Arnim, German writers influenced by Johann Gottfried von Herder, a philosopher who called for a rediscovery and preservation of Volkspoesie, the people's poetry. In 1805, Jacob worked as Savigny's assistant in Paris, collecting documents in German customs law and literature. Jacob and Wilhelm were prolific letter writers during their rare times apart, and while in Paris, Jacob wrote to Wilhelm in Marburg of his desire to devote his life to the study of German literary history. Arnim and Brentano had published a collection of old German folk songs, and Brentano, wanting to continue his philological pursuits, asked the Grimms for their help in combing library shelves for folk tales. The brothers found some texts in books, but they also focused on oral traditions, seeking out storytellers in friends and acquaintances. Most of them were women, one of whom, Dorothy Wilde, would later marry Wilhelm. The person who contributed the most to the Grimms' collection was Dorothy Pearson Weichmann, whose father owned a popular inn near Kassel. She shared the many tales that travelers had told her. A happy ending. Brentano did not use the 54 tales that Jacob and Wilhelm sent him in 1810, but Arnim urged them to publish their collection nonetheless. Published in 1812, Children's and Household Tales was not an immediate success. Even so, the brothers' subsequent publications of philological research, 2 volumes of German legends and 1 of early German literary history, among others, cemented their reputation as innovative scholars in the field. Over a 40-year span, 7 editions of the folk tale collection were published. The final edition, published in 1857, is the best known and is notably different from the first in both style and content. The brothers asserted that they collected the stories with exactness and truth without embellishment or details of their own. In a later edition, Wilhelm expanded the originally shorter, sparser prose and modified plots to make parts of the dark, tragic stories more accessible to children. Beginning in 1815, illustrations were added to the books. The stories in the first edition are thus more faithful to the oral tradition than those in the last, which, together with Wilhelm's adaptations, offered a more literary approach. The Grimms had not intended to publish a book of folk tales. They wanted to resurrect the German oral tradition, but in the process, they ultimately curated a culturally encompassing collection of tales. Though the brothers became a household name because of it, Children's and Household Tales tales was part of a bigger pursuit to excavate and preserve the oral and written forms of German culture to restore this treasure to the people. As philologists, collectors, researchers, and editors, the brothers helped establish the methodology of collecting and documenting folklore. Their pioneering scientific approach changed the course of historical linguistics, setting a standard worthy of imitation. So that's the article, but I'm going to postulate this. Would you call the Grimm brothers the first sellouts?
Seriously.
I mean, instead of preserving what they set out to preserve originally in their earlier works, they modified and changed the darker details to make it more commercial. I mean, isn't that the definition of selling out?
Selling out or making sure information can be spread as far and wide as possible.
I mean, they were already looked at as scholars. I mean, it's not like they didn't have a printing press.
True. But, I mean, to be with scholars, and they might have felt, let's say, you found this as very important information, but important so much so that, again, that you know that a good portion of targets are children. You can't really tell a child, that level of intense information. But the story, a little bit more accessible, a bit more easier for them to understand, clearly acknowledged.
Well, then they should have made a separate edition, like a for kids version, instead of perverting the actual work, right? Because that way they could have two editions without, because this makes it look like they sold out. Because they could have just made a for kids version, clearly designated, clearly marked for kids, and still have the original.
Very much so true. But Rachel does exist.
All right, so let's look at the dark side of the Grimm fairy tales. This is an article from History.com written by Jesse Greenspan. Originally published September 17th, 2013, updated August 22nd, 2018. Premarital sex. The original version of Rapunzel, published in 1812, a prince impregnates the title character after the two spend many days together living in joy and pleasure. Hans Dumm, meanwhile, is about a man who impregnates a princess simply by wishing it. And in The Frog King, a princess spends the night with her suitor once he turns into a handsome bachelor. The Grimms stripped the sex scenes from later versions of Rapunzel and The Frog King and eliminated Hans Dumm entirely. But hidden sexual innuendos in Grimm's fairy tales remained, according to psychoanalysts, including Sigmund Freud and Erich Fromm, who examined the book in the 20th century. Graphic violence. Although the Brothers Grimm toned down the sex in later editions of their work, they actually ramped up the violence. A particularly horrific incident occurs in The Robber Bridegroom, when some bandits drag a maiden into their underground hideout, force her to drink wine until her heart bursts, rip off her clothes, and then hack her body into pieces. That's very dark. Other tales have similarly gory episodes. In Cinderella, the evil stepsisters cut off their toes and heels trying to make the slipper fit, and later have their eyes pecked out by doves. In The Six Swans, an evil mother-in-law is burned at the stake. In The Goose Maid, a false bride is stripped naked, thrown into a barrel filled with nails, and dragged through the streets. And in Snow White, the wicked queen dies after being forced to dance in red-hot iron shoes. Even the love stories contain violence. The princess in The Frog King turns her amphibian companion into a human, not by kissing it, but instead by hurling it against a wall in frustration. Child abuse. Even more shocking, much of the violence in Grimm's fairy tales is directed at children. Snow White is just 7 years old when the huntsman takes her into the forest with orders to bring back her liver and lungs. In The Juniper Tree, a woman decapitates her stepson as he bends down to get an apple. She then chops up his body, cooks him in a stew, and serves it to her husband, who enjoys the meal so much he asks for seconds. Wow, that's really dark and disturbing. Snow White eventually wins the day, as does the boy in the juniper tree who is brought back to life. But not every child in the Grimm's book is so lucky. The title character in Frau Trude turns a disobedient girl into a block of wood and tosses her into a fire. In The Stubborn Child, a youngster dies after God lets him become sick. What do you make of this, Sid Irwin? These are all some dark, dark tales.
Dark indeed, but sometimes stories to the degree in those sense, I guess I wonder to give fair warning to children because for there are evils out there that do exist that could care less whether or not you be a normal person or a child.
They don't discriminate. They don't. They're not ageists in terms of who they initiate violence against.
They are not. Again, that is one of the concepts. I think there are some stories that I have seen, even as of recent, where they have committed atrocities against children, and it is very, very disturbing. I believe one such story I saw in I only mentioned the incident itself, but there was I guess, summoned spirit that a serial killer had invoked. And the serial killer had basically simply, I believe, killed the parents by slitting their throats. And to save the child for last, the invoked spirit told him, no, wait, I want you to see something instead. He let the child go, let the child feel safe. And the serial killer was confused, couldn't understand it. He told him to wait. As the child saw the door ready to exit, a monster swooped in and tore the child apart.
Well, that's pretty dark. What's that? What's that from?
I believe that was from an anime called Fate Stay Night. Yes. That was actually very dark. I felt very bad. I'm like, that was on some level of Grimm's fairy tales. To have a story like that.
Anti-Semitism. The Grimms gathered over 200 tales for their collection, 3 of which contain Jewish characters. In The Jew and the Brambles, the protagonist happily torments a Jew by forcing him to dance in a thicket of thorns. He also insults the Jew, calling him a dirty dog, among other things. Later on, a judge doubts that a Jew would ever voluntarily give away money. The Jew in the story turns out to be a thief and is hanged. In The Good Bargain, a Jewish man is likewise portrayed as a penny-pinching swindler. During the Third Reich, the Jews adopted the Grimm's tales for propaganda purposes. They claimed, for instance, that Little Red Riding Hood symbolized the German people suffering at the hands of the Jewish wolf, and that Cinderella's Aryan purity distinguished her from her mongrel stepsisters. Incest. In All Kinds of Fur, a king promises his dying wife that he will only remarry if his new bride is as beautiful as her. Unfortunately, no such woman exists in the whole world except his daughter, who ends up escaping his clutches by fleeing into the wilderness. While interviewing sources, the Grimms likewise heard versions of a different story, The Girl Without Hands, with an incestuous father. Nevertheless, in all editions of their book, they recast this father as the devil. Wicked mothers. Evil step-parents are a dime a dozen in fairy tales, but the Grimms originally included some evil biological mothers as well. In the 1812 version of Hansel and Gretel, a wife persuades her husband to abandon their children in the woods because they don't have enough food to feed them. Snow White also has an evil mother who at first wishes for and then becomes infuriated by her daughter's beauty. The Grimms turned both of these characters into stepmothers in subsequent editions, and mothers have essentially remained off the hook ever since in the retelling of these stories. Quite.
It makes me laugh as I have heard those stories before in that form.
denofgeek.com had an interesting article on the dark origins of the Grimm's fairy tales as well. This was written by Sarah Dobbs, published January 3rd, 2017. Every fairy tale ends with a happily ever after, right? Well, not to begin with, they didn't. If you had to recount the story of Cinderella right now, you could probably do it quite easily. Wicked stepmother, glass slipper, stroke of midnight, blah, blah, blah. You could probably also reel off the story of Snow White or Little Red Riding Hood without needing to really think about it too much. These stories are well woven into our cultural DNA by now, and a lot of that is down to the work of the Grimm brothers. But the versions we know now aren't the versions the Grimms originally published, and these stories weren't originally intended for kids at all. Back in the early 1800s, Jacob and Wilhelm Grimm were working as librarians. Born into a well-off family, their lives took a turn for the worse when their father died, and the brothers struggled through school and university in poverty. Librarians weren't particularly well paid either, but the Grimms were both keen scholars, and their work gave them both time and opportunity for their own research that let them put together a collection of folk tales. It sounds like a kind of whimsical project, but the Grimm's work was actually part of a wider political movement in Germany at the time. The country was split into 200 principalities, and many people, including the Grimm's law professor, Friedrich von Savigny, wanted to see them united as a single nation. To that end, many writers and thinkers were turning to traditional folktales to explore, or maybe define, a kind of German national identity. The theory was that these stories, passed down from one generation to the next, contained the collective hopes, fears, and morals of the German people. The Grimms weren't the only ones putting together collections of folklore, but it's their work that became the best known. Their first volumes of stories, Kinder- und Hausmärchen, or Children's and the Household Tales, contained 86 stories gathered together from the Grimms' research and from their friends and acquaintances. The Grimms included stories commonly told in other regions of the world if they thought they had German roots somewhere along the line, including rewritten versions of stories thought to be original to French author Charles Perrault. And all the stories were edited both so that they used Germanic words and phrases and so they sounded authentically rustic. It's hard to know now how cynically that might have been done, so maybe it's best to give the Grimms the benefit of the doubt and assume they thought they were doing what they thought was best. One thing they definitely were doing, though, was making sure to include all the gory details of the more didactic stories in their collection. You've probably heard that most fairy tales were much nastier in their original forms than they are in the later Disney-fied versions, but it's still striking just how much darker they were. If you don't feel like having your childhood illusions shattered, click away now because I'm about to share some of the grisly details from the original versions of some beloved fairy tales. Snow White. According to Disney, threatened by her stepdaughter's beauty, a wicked stepmother orders a huntsman to take the girl into the woods and kill her, bringing back her heart. The huntsman can't do it and lets Snow White escape into the forest. She finds a tiny house where singing dwarves, all named for the defining characteristics, live. They decide to let her stay to keep house for them. The wicked queen finds out via her magic mirror that Snow White isn't dead and sets out to kill her with a poisoned apple. Though the dwarves get revenge by driving the queen off the edge of a cliff, they can't wake Snow White until a passing prince comes and wakes her with true love's kiss. Then they live happily ever after. And just a quick point here, is the magic mirror the black mirror that we have now that could see anywhere into the world at any time?
Very curious correlation.
And then, of course, they threw the bite in the apple that's in there, which obviously everybody knows where that's from. Okay, originally, in the first edition of the story, it wasn't a wicked stepmother at all. It was Snow White's mother. And she didn't just want Snow White's heart, she wanted her lungs and liver, too. When she discovers that the huntsman hasn't killed the girl, she sets out to try to kill her in 3 different ways. With an overly tight corset, with a poisoned comb, and finally with a poisoned apple. It's not true love's kiss that revives Snow White. It's a good shake as the prince attempts to make off with Snow White's glass coffin. And the queen doesn't get pushed off a cliff. She's forced to dance herself to death in a pair of red-hot iron shoes. Ouch. And another point here, and we'll get into the mud flood possibilities, but this story is eerily similar to a parent selling their child's organs on the black market, is it not? She wants her heart, lungs, and liver. If there was some kind of possibly more advanced, although in a different way, possibly some kind of Tartarian history, that's curious. Why would you want lungs, liver? Like, what? It doesn't make sense, right? But if you want to sell them on the black market because you're poor, that makes a little bit more sense, doesn't it?
It was, but also witchcraft, I believe, and such.
Yes, of course, there's occult origins there. But do they normally do lungs as well? They obviously the heart, but lungs and liver, are they prevalent in In the occult, I'm not sure. I guess possibly. But let's move on to Cinderella. According to Disney, after her widowed father remarries and then dies, Cinderella is left at the mercy of her wicked stepmother and two ugly stepsisters. They force her to do manual labor and wear rags, but she's so sweet, kind, and beautiful that even wild animals love her and help her out. When the prince of the kingdom throws a ball, Cinderella's fairy godmother appears and creates a dress, coach, and footman for her so she can go to the party. The prince falls in love with her, but the magic ends at midnight, so she has to run away, leaving behind only her glass slipper. The prince travels the land looking for the girl who fits the shoe, but her stepsisters sabotage her by smashing it. Luckily, she still has the other shoe, so she gets to live happily ever after too. But originally, the Cinderella story appeared in a volume of Charles Perrault's Fairy Tales, but in the Grimm's version, Cinderella, or Aschenputtel, Ash Fool, has two beautiful stepsisters. They just happen to be utterly horrible. There's no fairy godmother, just white doves sent to help Cinderella by her dead mother, and the prince actually holds 3 balls. At midnight on the third night, the prince lays a tar trap for Cinderella, which is where she loses her shoe. When her sisters get the chance to try on the missing shoe, they each cut off different parts of their feet in order to fit into the tiny slipper. But the blood dripping from their shoes gives them away. I mean, you got to admire their determination for that, right?
People go to some very interesting, strange lengths for what they really want, even if they don't realize that what they really want.
The prince eventually finds his girl, and at their wedding, the magic doves reappear to peck out the evil sister's eyes. Sleeping Beauty. According to Disney, a king and queen throw a huge party to celebrate the birth of their daughter, Aurora, but though they invite 3 good fairies who each give her blessings, they didn't invite the evil fairy, Maleficent. Angry about being snubbed, she gate crashes the party and bestows upon the girl a curse. Was she the first party crasher? Before she turns 16, she'll prick her finger on a spinning wheel and die. One of the good fairies manages to modify the curse so that Aurora won't die. She'll just sleep until she's awoken by a true love's kiss. Yep, that again. The fairies try to hide the girl, and she eventually meets and sings to the prince in the forest. But curses can't be hidden from, so she ends up pricking her finger and falling asleep anyway. Maleficent locks the prince in her dungeon so he can't break the curse. But the good fairies rescue him. Maleficent turns into a dragon because that's awesome, but the prince pushes her off a cliff and wakes Aurora with a kiss. Cue the happily ever after bit. But originally, this is an interesting one because the Grimm version of the story is actually pretty close to the Disney version. There's a magic frog at the beginning, 13 fairies instead of 3, and lots of dead suitors stuck in the forest surrounding the castle. But otherwise, the story is pretty similar. However, the story was published by authors before the Grimms got their hands on it, and those versions are pretty nasty. In Giambattista's version from 1634, once the prince finds Sleeping Beauty, he rapes her, and she only wakes up when one of the children she bore while asleep sucks the splinter out of her finger by mistake. And though Perrault's 1697 version removes the rapes, it chucks in an epilogue with an evil stepmother who tries to eat the happy couple's children and ends up being thrown into a pit of vipers. Says something when the Grimm's version is nicer than the others, doesn't it? Do you think it's a coincidence that the Grimm's fairy tales are kind of grim?
That's funny. It's all in the name, right? But I mean, coincidentally, it could just be again all in the name. But I honestly feel it's suited. It works for that case because I mean, like you said, it's supposed to be like a forewarning for all the things that might go bump in the night and such.
Well, the definitions are stern, admitting of no appeasement or compromise, of a sinister or ghastly character, repellent, having a harsh, surly, foreboding, or morbid air, or fierce, savage, or cruel. And the origin of the word is somewhere before the year 900, Middle English, Old Saxon, Old High German, Grimm with 2 M's. So it is, I don't know, that's kind of weird. I mean, does that lead credence to the whole scripted reality theory where all the world's a stage and the giveaways are in the names? But I don't want to go down that rabbit hole, even though it's Halloween. Let's move on to Rapunzel. According to Disney, Disney's adaptation of Rapunzel Tangled, is very recent and not very traditional. Rapunzel gets a lot more agency than most other Disney princesses, and her prince isn't a prince at all. But the elements of a sanitized Rapunzel story are there. A beautiful princess is kept captive by a witch who uses the girl's long hair to climb in and out of a tower prison, and it's only when she meets a man that she gets to escape. But originally, according to the Grimms, the reason the Wicked Witch gets to make off with the baby Rapunzel is that her dad stole herbs from the witch's garden to meet his wife's cravings. And when he got caught, he agreed to hand over his firstborn. Stuck in the tower, Rapunzel lets down her hair for the witch day after day, but when a passing prince hears her singing, he decides to pay Rapunzel a visit himself. He secretly visits her several times, and the witch only finds out because Rapunzel gets pregnant and innocently asks why her belly's getting so big. I mean, maybe she just started eating more. In a rage, the witch cuts off the girl's hair, uses it to lure the prince back into the tower, then chucks him off the top, letting him fall into a thorn bush that plucks out his eyes. Eventually, though, there is a happy ending where the couple get back together and Rapunzel's tears heal the prince's eyes. Disturbed enough yet? There's more. In some of the Grimm stories, there's an unpleasant theme of anti-Semitism. For example, in one story, the hero tortures a Jewish man by making him dance on thorns until he's torn and bleeding as punishment for some imagined sins. When the man cries for help, the judge sides with his torturer, and the Jew is hanged as a thief. The racism combined with German patriotism might explain why the Nazis saw the Grimm fairy tales as such a great match for their propaganda. In films aimed at kids, Little Red Riding Hood gets rescued by a man in an SS uniform, while Puss in Boots morphs into a kind of Hitler figure at the end. Scary stuff. That's jumping a long way into the future, though. Back in the 1800s, after the first edition of the collection was published, the Grimms were criticized for writing stories that were unsuitable for children. In response, they revised some of the stories to soften their rough edges, and later editions were split. Large editions contained all the stories with academic annotations by the brothers, while small editions contained selected re-edited stories deemed suitable for kids. Those edits created a wider audience from the Grimm's books and probably ensured that their stories endured. After all, no one wants a bedtime story that gives them nightmares. Okay, so it looks like they kind of did do what I suggested, where they had different editions.
Indeed. That's what it sounds like.
I would still say that they kind of sold out because it says that they were criticized, and in response, they revised some of the stories to roughen their edges initially. So they were initially sellouts, then they split it into different editions. So I guess they made amends, so to speak, for their sellout nature. I'm still gonna say they might have been the first sellouts.
Fair enough.
All right, so let's get a little bit more technical. This is an interesting article by Renee Hall, curiously featured on theosophy-nw.org, The DNA of Fairy Tales, Their Origin and Meaning. These fairy tales are not senseless stories written for the amusement of the idle. They embody the profound religion of our forefathers. That quote is from W.S.W. Anson, Asgard and the Gods, page 21. In this new millennium, fairy tales are flourishing. The children's section of libraries and bookshops are bursting with beautiful editions of well-known fairy tales with exotic, vivid illustrations. Their collections are worldwide: Russian, German, Japanese, Chinese, Persian, Scandinavian, African, Australian, North American, Yugoslavian, British, and more. To have survived over the ages, the traditional fairy tales must have very strong and special genes. Mere entertainment is very short-lived. What is the secret of their longevity? Let's look at an Indian version of a perennial favorite. Once upon a time, a Hindu Raja had an only daughter who was born with a golden necklace. In this necklace was her soul, and if the necklace were taken off and worn by someone else, the princess would die. One birthday, the Raja gave his daughter a pair of slippers ornamented with gold and gems. The princess went upon the mountain to pluck flowers, and while there, one of her slippers fell down into a forest. A prince hunting in the forest picked up the lost slipper and was so charmed with it that he desired to make its owner his wife. He made his wish known everywhere, but no one claimed the slipper, and the poor prince grew very sad. At last, some people from the Raja's country heard of it and told the prince where to find the Raja's daughter. He came and asked for her to be his wife, and they were married. Sometime after, another wife of the prince, jealous of the Raja's daughter, stole her necklace and put it on her own neck. The Raja's daughter died, but her body did not decay, nor did her face lose its bloom. And the prince went every day to see her, for he still loved her very much. When he found out the secret of the necklace, he got it back and put it on his dead wife's neck. Her soul was born again in her, and she came back to life, and they lived happily ever after. You know what's interesting? It's almost like a combination of Cinderella and Sleeping Beauty. Did you fall asleep, Sid?
Not processing. Just thinking about the stories in itself.
Well, if it's from ancient India, I mean, it's probably a lot older than anything the Grimms found, but yeah, it is quite interesting. These themes, that's what I was saying before, the origin of a lot of these fairy tales might be a single source. Continuing on here, the lost slipper is also found in an ancient Greek legend, which tells that while a beautiful woman named Rhodope, the rosy-cheeked, was bathing, an eagle picked up one of her slippers and flew away with it. The eagle carried it off to Egypt and dropped it into the lap of the king of that country. The slipper was so small and beautiful that he fell in love with the wearer of it and had her sought for, and when she was found, he made her his wife. As you will have guessed, Cinderella is the English variation of this story. Little Polly Flinders who sat among the cinders. I don't know if it came to England from German Aschenputtel, the French Cendrillon, or the Scandinavian Ashkungen, Ash Child. Here we have Indian, Greek, French, German, Scandinavian, and English versions of the same tale, with each country leaving its particular imprint or flavor on a basic story. In an interpretation offered by Elsa Britta Tichenel in her Masks of Odin, she calls Askungen Cinderella. A scion of the noble ash tree, Yggdrasil, the tree of life, which bears the worlds with all their life forms on its branches. All living beings are children of the cosmic ash tree, from the minutest particle to the largest. What is more, each of us is not only a member of the cosmic tree, but a tree of life in his own right. The ash child is also cyclically reborn from the ashes of its former self, like the phoenix. Quite interesting. Such fairy tales belong to an oral tradition handed down by country people from generation to generation and only relatively recently written down. Who were their original authors? Scholars of comparative philology and mythology agree that there is indeed a common source. John Thackeray Bunce, author of Fairy Tales, Their Origin and Meaning, 1878, says that Celtic, Teutonic, and Nordic myths echo the eternal and universal themes and vivid imagery found in the sacred books of the Hindus and the Persians, the Vedas and the Zend Avesta. Swedish scholar Frederick Sander, who published his Rigveda Edda about 1890, was convinced that Norse mythology came from India and preserves Hindu myths more faithfully than do the classic Greek and Roman, which are much disfigured. So our humble fairy tale has a royal, or rather divine, lineage. The Secret Doctrine, of course, the main book of Theosophy, Helena Blavatsky. We read that the Rig Veda, the oldest of all known ancient records, may be shown to corroborate the occult teachings in almost every respect, and that the Vedas are the mirror of eternal wisdom. Is this the reason that fairy tales managed to survive the arrival of Christianity in Europe? Fanatics of the new religion caused a devastating blow to folklore and old traditions, which were outlawed and banished as pagan. We are all too familiar with the cruel intolerance and harsh treatment of so-called heretics who dared to show any allegiance to their old customs and beliefs. Perhaps disguised by the fairies themselves, these simple nuggets of pure wisdom escaped the persecution, dogma, and deterioration of formal religious institutions over the ages. Fortunately, distant Iceland escaped this persecution, and there Samund the Wise lived and wrote down the poetic Elder Edda, The myths have given rise to numberless folktales and fairy tales which have been adapted to various media for expression, from nursery rhymes to grand opera, and they include collections made by students of folklore such as the Brothers Grimm in the 19th century. So, you know what's interesting here, though? If there was a great reset, like the mud flood theory postulates, were these fairy tales from the previous iterations of civilization, whether it was Tartaria, Atlantis, whatever, then there was some kind of great reset, possibly in the form of a mud flood, possibly in the form of pandemics, real or fake. And this great reset, they outlawed all these older stories because they don't want people to know what happened before.
Not surprising. I mean, no one's ever really proud to admit a rather shady and violent history.
Perhaps scarier still is some believe we're in the middle of a great reset right now. Just with the censoring on the internet, whatever happens in this, if there is a new reset, will everything from before the reset be banned and hidden?
Well, he says a lot about that now. I mean, that's why we have so many conspiracy theories about the Illuminati and MK Ultra and such.
Back to the article. While the ancient records of the Veda and Edda are recognized as the reservoir for myths and their smaller cousins, the fairy tales, the clue to their primary source of inspiration may be found by considering hints in some of the world's oldest tradition, which tell of humanity's golden age of innocence, when higher beings impressed our minds with primal truths. This reminder gives us the freedom and confidence to interpret and understand the fairy tale according to our own wisdom. Many well-known fairy stories share a common format. A forlorn, orphaned young person cast out from his or her former home after various trials and tribulations is rescued and united with a loved one, a parent, or royal personage. Cinderella serves as a good model. The orphan child is trapped and bullied by her wicked stepmother and ugly stepsisters, meaning that the human soul is estranged from its spiritual nature or father in heaven and comes under the unpleasant control and influence of the lower side of nature. These are not her natural blood relatives, suggesting that the human soul rightly belongs to its better side. Dislodged from its proper status, the soul struggles to recover its legitimate state. By purity and virtue, it gains the support and help of its fairy godmother, the spiritual soul. Many tales use the godmother and giver of gifts to represent the soul's finer qualities unfolded through merit. This elven power, uniting the human soul with its divine source, is the channel or elf which confers on its child all earned spiritual endowments. That's a bit deep. What do you think of digesting that write-up right there, Sid? Still awake? Sid Irwin, you still there?
That I am.
Did you digest that? Or did you go Maxwell on me?
I could have pulled Maxwell. Because you were just talking about actually, processing.
The soul being dislodged by the and having an orphan setting with non-blood family, and then being reunited with blood family, or the proper position of the human soul with its divine source.
Huh. Very interesting. I've never heard that interpretation before. So I guess I can see how that would make sense in a sense. Yeah, well, I mean, I guess in a sense how some children are adopted, and let's say from a different country and taken in and raised, but it's very odd because you have no connections whatsoever to the familiar or what should be familiar to you, or something natural or according to the ways you were raised, and then that make you feel disjointed. And almost you have to stop being who you are in order to assimilate into this new structure.
But there's only suffering to be found in this lower state until you're reunited with your correct state and everything gets aligned. But I'm about to let me drop another mind shock, because this is mind shock. Here's my theory. Perhaps it's more literal than we know. Again, if you haven't checked out the Mindshock Altered History series, we explore the probably altered history of mankind. And with these great resets or mud floods and Tartaria, one aspect of that are orphan trains. We have these empty cities, and then supposedly these orphan trains to repopulate these cities, these orphans taken from their families. This is all some dark, dark stuff. We'll be doing a dedicated episode just on the orphan trains and the whole orphan issue with kids being taken from parents in one country and moved to another, so to speak, or colonies in other continents, and for what true purpose after a particular reset. So their memories are technically wiped, because if you take a child when they're young from their parents, they don't know anything of the old world, the old customs, or even necessarily the old language. If you transport them somewhere else and teach them a new language at a very young age, the old one could be lost. So there's a lot to unpack there, but perhaps the story of these orphans in these fairy tales, which is very, very common in other tales, perhaps there's a literal truth there as well, describing some kind of life situation or way of life after the reset or in the middle of a reset.
Well, that's an interesting way to view that interpretation.
Also, perhaps if the originators of these fairy tales, they might have knew to a certain extent that they'd be persecuted for it, so they had to make them a little bit sneakier. So they couldn't outright say the truth, so to speak. They had to make it a little bit more hidden so it would survive. And that was their legacy or contribution to the future, to sneak in enough hints that history wouldn't repeat itself, possibly.
Makes sense, very possible. Someone could believe how, Brazilian slaves would hide them practicing their martial arts in a form of dance. That's capoeira.
You know what's interesting about capoeira? They did it with knives on their feet. I mean, that doesn't seem to hide much. But anyway, although I don't know when they started using the knives, but I've seen the demos where they have knives on their feet. It's pretty crazy.
I have to see that.
Let's finish this Theosophy article. The analogy of our dual nature thus provides the key for decoding these fairy tales. What a brilliant method of teaching and passing on knowledge of our composite nature, which can be applied on a macrocosmic level as well. Maybe that's the reason why the tales feel comfortable and familiar to us, as if we've always known them. And of course we have. Whatever the story, it is simply a mirror image of ourselves. The cast of king, queen, prince, and princess, father, fairy, witch, frog, giant, ogre, elf, dragon, white horse, beast, orphan child, is part and parcel of each one of us. Our strengths and frailties are portrayed in separate roles, each playing a part in our evolutionary growth, until after the struggles and obstacles, the unfolding of the story, we finally find the prince or princess, our higher self, and marry to live happily ever after until we turn the page to the next story. Did you realize that ancient wisdom was told to you when you were at your mother's knee, and that your parents, grandparents, uncles, and aunts are in turn passing on these eternal and vital truths to the next generation of children wherever you tell one of these classical fairy tales, show a video, or take them to see a pantomime or Walt Disney film? Snow White, Aladdin, Puss in Boots, Jack and the Beanstalk, Beauty and the Beast, and the rest show no sign of waning popularity even in our busy, noisy age. Unalloyed, these tales continue to enchant, puzzle, teach, and inspire, not only with ethics and altruism, but the esoteric meaning of life itself. Let's hope that, like the Sleeping Beauty, those who are still slumbering will wake up to their message, know thyself. So that's quite deep, and I do want to add something else regarding the archetypes, which of course needs to be its own podcast series. But is there an aspect here where the fairy tales, and the reason a lot of them are familiar, is due to the cosmic consciousness, the Akashic record, whatever you want to call it, where we all have some kind of a shared consciousness that can tap into the history of all reality.
It's very well possible.
And even genetic memory per se, in our familial or genetic lines, if before the reset, and again, some of the coincidence theorists might jump on top of this, if there was a reset, of course, this is Mindshock. The only thing we know for sure is that we don't know anything for sure. But if there was a reset, is there some kind of genetic memory that has been passed down through our genes? So even in these fairy tales, there's something very familiar or enchanting about some of these stories, as if it feels familiar to a certain extent to live in some of these majestic kingdoms and understand some of these characters. It's almost like a way of life that possibly our ancestors had, and it's passed down in genetic memory.
I mean, it's always a one interesting theory. I mean, I think there has been examples, have there not, of people who, it's like it's that sixth sense about something, or something you should avoid, or something you should do, or it's just like you just happen to know what you should do in a certain situation. Not that you've ever had experience in dealing with it before, but to come find that out that maybe again a family member in your past had dealt with these things or had a certain inclination to this or that. I mean, I can understand look at that myself with even in a simple fashion where you may have a certain thing that you enjoy to do, and a family member that you barely talk to, barely see, somehow develops also similarities to an uncanny degree.
Yes, plenty to ponder with the fairy tales, the brothers Grimm, the Grimm origins. Is it all a coincidence, or is there more to it? Is everything in reality linked? Are we living on a stage? Is the whole world a stage? Everyone are actors? I don't know what's going on in this reality, but again, this is Mindshock, where the only thing we know for sure is we don't know anything for sure. Hope you guys enjoyed another edition of the Mindshock podcast. Have a happy and safe Halloween out there. If you haven't checked out the other Mindshock Halloween podcasts, check those out. We delve into the occult origins of Halloween and the possible demonic energy you might be lending to otherworldly forces in participation in certain rituals. So, again, stay safe and vigilant out there. If you enjoyed this podcast, make sure to hit that like button and share it across social media platforms, of which you can find us on Twitter, Facebook, Reddit, and Patreon. Patrons do get priority for case topic logical analysis requests. You could also be a guest on the podcast depending on your tier. Make sure you subscribe to the channel, hit the bell for notifications. Make sure you allow your device to have those notifications come through. You could also just go to youtube.com/Mindshock. And if you enjoy the podcast, you can donate to our PayPal. Just check the link in the description. This is Bruce McGuire signing off.
And Sid Irwin.
Catch you guys next time.